That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G is specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441.
Good morning and welcome to That's Debatable. I am Jan McVarish, the Free Speech Union's Education and Events Director, and I'm joined again this week by Connie Shaw, our new External Affairs Officer. We had a great response to Connie joining us last week. Do you want to say some of the responses you had on Twitter, Connie, when you shared the podcast?
Yeah, people were very pleased, it was really good, I think. Obviously, university council culture is a big issue, and I think sometimes something that's not spoken about enough because there are very few students who are willing to, for understandable reasons, to speak about what's happened to them. So yeah, I thought it was a really good opportunity to talk about that, and the response was really great.
Yeah, no, it was really nice to see. I had loads of notifications because you tagged, or somebody tagged me. So I never normally have this many notifications. I don't post that much on Twitter. Great. Okay, so this week we are going to talk about a couple of things. And the first thing we wanted to talk about was our campaign against what we're calling the Banter ban. There's been a few new elements to our campaign that we've put out there this week. So, Connie, do you want to explain to the listeners what the Banter ban is all about?
So the Banter ban is in reference to a specific clause in the Employment Rights Bill, which has been going through Parliament since October last year. And the clause is clause 20, which means, and if it's passed and not amended, employers will be liable for their employees being harassed by third parties, which means customers, members of the public. So if you're working behind a bar in a pub, that is sort of anyone who's coming in. And it also extends to basically overhearing offensive remarks or what the employee might find offensive. And the employer is at risk of being sued, or because the employee will have the right to sue their employer if they don't take all reasonable measures or steps to protect their employee from harassment. And that harassment does include overheard remarks, because an employment tribunal found that under the Equality Act, harassment does count in some situations as just overhearing something. And there have been examples in the past of people successfully suing their employers for overheard conversations on the basis that they felt harassed due to on the basis of their protected characteristic. So it's very concerning for hospitality venues, comedy clubs, and that's why we've just released a video that a comedy club that was hosting Comedy Unleashed, where Toby spoke about the Banter ban and interviewed some of the comedians who are involved with Comedy Unleashed, including Josh Howie and Francis Foster, because it's such a big risk to employers, because they're going to have to essentially be checking what their customers are talking about out of fear of not being sued by employees. And we all know that when you're in the pub and people have had a few drinks, we have conversations amongst each other that may not normally be discussed. The pub is somewhere to talk about these things, although people love to say, the last thing you should be talking about in a pub is politics, but we all know that's not true, and people always do. And so it's of great concern, or should be a great concern. Even the EHRC has expressed concerns about this aspect of the bill, because it could be that employers feel like they need to really go above and beyond to make sure that their customers or third parties aren't having controversial conversations that their employees might be able to claim are harassment. So that's what the Free Speech Union is campaigning for at the moment, to amend the Employment Rights Bill so that Clause 20, the power of Clause 20, is basically stopped. And Toby and some cross-party peers have tabled 3 amendments to basically thwart the power that the clause might have. One of them being exempting certain venues such as comedy clubs and pubs, because they're going to be the ones at most risk. And making sure, a second one is to sort of safeguard the part of the Equality Act, which means that so that it would mean that employers are only liable after more than one complaint. So it can't just be off one complaint. There has to be at least some history of this member of staff feeling harassed. And then the third one is clarifying that overheard remarks cannot be considered harassment if they were part of a political conversation or a conversation about social values and or religious conversations. And obviously, if any one of those amendments was passed, that would essentially cut out any powers that Clause 20 would have. But the bill is will be going through the report stage in the House of Lords very shortly. And there's still time to act, to write to to write to a member of the House of Lords using the tool on the FSU website. So it's all done very quickly for you. So there's still time to put pressure on people to support these amendments, which you can do if you look on the FSU website. We'll link it below. To write to a member of the House of Lords to do that.
Yes, and so this, in effect, could possibly give employees power of veto over what is said in their place of work, but also, as you say, the danger as well is that then a precautionary approach is taken by the employer, the business owner, in order to prevent that even occurring. So that you can just really imagine the situations. And there's a weird elision between social spaces and civic spaces and the workplace, because we all kind of know there's things we can't say and talk about in the workplace. And that's just the nature of the work environment. In reality, you don't get to bring your whole self to work, no matter how many times people have been told that's the case. But actually, when you're in a civic space and when you're in a comedy club just laughing, or you're a comedian holding forth, or you're in a pub and you are freely associating with your friends, your colleagues, other people, and it's outside of work now, then really those kind of restraints shouldn't be applying, and we need to be free in those places of free association. So it is really important. And it's kind of interesting. I remember a number of years ago when there was some discussion about the kinds of abuse that football players have when they're on the pitch. And it was a panel discussion somewhere or other about it. And I was really struck because in my mind, football is a free-for-all, and the things that are said and hurled at the opposite team or even your own team from the fans are just kind of not the kind of thing you would ever really expect to hear anywhere else. And there's songs and there's just kind of witty things thrown out, incredibly abusive things, and obviously loads of swearing. And a woman on the panel who was lobbying for some kind of greater protection for football players said, well, it's a workplace like any other. And I thought, what makes you think that you could possibly control, in a small club, 24,000 people in order to protect the 22 that are on the pitch at any one time? It's really, really bizarre. And you can see that sort of just an inability to understand what free association really means and how free we need to be in our speech when we're actually just hanging out with our friends or going to a performance and those places where freedom needs to exist. So there's the video you referred to. Toby interviews Andrew Doyle and Josh Howie and Francis Foster, as you said, and then it also has addressed the crowd in the club. And they use the example of Jerry Sadowitz, I've seen him live. It's just the most unbelievably offensive comedian and brilliant magician and comedian who goes out of his way to be offensive. That's the whole point of Jerry Sadowitz. He's supposed to be a totally unlikable, reprehensible character. And he's been a classic at the Edinburgh Fringe for years. That's his kind of domain. And then last year, as the comedians describe, because some members of staff in the venue where he was due to perform multiple times objected to his act, his shows didn't go ahead. And he then performed in London. And I went to that show, I think it was at Hammersmith Apollo, and it was just unbelievably offensive and extremely funny, but there was nothing that was off limits. And he's the kind of person that if he's told he can't say something, he says exactly that, even more. But I was looking around the room and looking at the kind of security people and the ushers, standing there with arms folded and thinking, my God, if they get to actually decide what can and can't be said on stage, it's a total disaster. So that was a very sort of visible example of how you cannot have anybody other than the artist deciding what they can and can't say. And similarly, the audience has got a right to hear, and we've got a right to hear in those kind of public settings. And I think, sorry.
I was going to say, even more scarily, because the law, basically, the requirement for a employer to be held responsible for something like this is whether they have taken all reasonable steps to make sure that their employees aren't subject to third-party harassment. So even if a complaint isn't made at the time, if there's a later claim made against an employer and the jury or employment tribunal finds out that there was a situation in which a hostile environment, for example, was created because of, for example, an offensive act or an overheard comment in a pub, that can still be then used against the employer because they may not have taken all reasonable steps to protect their employees from harassment, even if it wasn't complained about at the time. Right. So they may not have been aware at the time that could later come back to bite you.
Yeah.
And it is just really ridiculous to think how, as a pub, for example, you want as many customers as you can get. And that's why we sort of joke about having banter bouncers, because ultimately, how on earth is a landlord meant to control the types of people coming into the pub, and or what conversations they're having, other than making sure that they're walking around the pub and themselves overhearing, making sure they're listening to people's conversations. I mean, and the football example as well, for the person on the panel who said that, it's just a complete. Have we all of a sudden forgot what value fans bring to football clubs? And if imagine trying to tell fans of a football club that they can't say this chant that they've been chanting for years. But then I guess the other side of the argument, people could say, well, what about racist? What about racist chants? Surely those players shouldn't be subject to that. But I would say, I think actually there has been a big enough campaign and public shaming of people who do say horrific things without the law needing to get involved. The issue is that the law is becoming so overreaching, and the fact that it's based on the perceived effect or the perceived offence to those remarks rather than whether the remarks are objectively offensive. And that's why one of the amendments means that the comments would have to be objectively grossly offensive for them to count as any sort of harassment.
Yeah, it's really strange, isn't it? It's almost like there's the battles being fought against the 1970s, because in the 1970s and probably into the 80s, it really was, because there was racism in society, there was also racism on the terraces, and directed at black players, and and the hostility and aggression that you would get in a football match would take that shape, because that was out there in society. But now that, generally people agree that there's much less of that. And in lots of teams, the majority of players are black. And so the idea that extremely well paid, and the idea that somehow all the power is in the other direction is really bizarre. And also you look at fans, the crowds are much more mixed than they ever were, especially with London clubs. My club, Crystal Palace, which recently won the FA Cup. And if you look at the players and you look at the crowds, it's just a complete mix of people. And I don't think I've ever really heard racist stuff in the grounds, because the character of the club is not that. And I don't think that's because of enforcement. That is because it just kind of has fallen out of fashion and fallen out of favour. And it's not to say that people are not obscene in what they shout, but it's not necessarily racialised like it would have been, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So all of that stuff's changed. I mean, I know there have been campaigns, but I suspect it would have happened anyway. By the fact that you're going with your black friend, you're not going to therefore be the person who's shouting racial abuse at a black player, when there's 8 other excellent players on the pitch, whatever In a football team, there's 11. But what I mean is there's just so many players who are coming from all over the world now as well, who are very well loved by their clubs, that it doesn't really make sense anymore to kind of single out one person. Okay, well, so we can also direct people towards seeing Toby speak about the Banter ban on Sunday night's Free Speech Nation on GB News. So Andrew Doyle was back for a guest slot on Sunday night's programme. So about 90 minutes into the programme, Toby does a 10-minute interview. So we'll put that in the notes as well. Okay, and then something else we were going to talk about. We were sort of looking around for stories, and this was one that you spotted about a school teacher in America who's got into trouble for the way he's chosen to teach literature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this guy is called Matthew Mastronardi, and I first saw it on X and then realised actually it's been covered by quite a few news outlets. But he's a Spanish teacher, and he's going eventually this month he's having a hearing as to whether he's going to lose his job or not, because in a class he overheard conversations. He heard some students talking about the fact that they thought that when you were to read, even within context, if you're reading To Kill a Mockingbird, for example, which is the book in question in this case, they were saying that you should skip over the N-word because it's so offensive that even reading it in context would be wrong, even if that's what the author wrote. And he overheard their conversation and just sort of challenged them and said that he disagreed. And then a student said to him, "So would you say it?" And he describes in his Twitter thread that he felt like he couldn't back down because he had to stick to what he'd been saying. And so he said, yes, I would if I was reading that out to a class. And so they basically dared him to do it. And so he stood up in front of the class, read the passage out that had the N-word in, and said it in context. And without knowing at the time, a student was recording underneath a desk, and that video has been posted on the internet. And shortly afterwards, he received a disciplinary letter from the school and was told that it was unprofessional communication with the students. And now it looks like his contract might not be renewed because of this incident. But what's really interesting is actually some of the students have started a petition for him to keep his job, which is really lovely to see. But yeah, it was something that came up a lot when I was at school as to whether you would read a racial slur, even if it was in context. And actually, I remember even at A level, when we were learning about the Weimar Republic, and my history teacher included the N-word in the sort of text that he'd provided for us. And me and one of my friends complained to him and told him that this is unacceptable. You should at least asterisk this out. And looking back now, I just feel so awful. And he was one of those people who...
I'm impressed by your honesty. The patterns emerging.
Oh, yeah, no, but obviously I've spoken about a lot how I used to believe that silencing people and trying to compel people to fall in line was an appropriate way to deal with things. But even when we read, I can't remember, Of Mice and Men as well, that it was a massive topic then. Some English teachers would say it out loud. It's like, oh my God. But it's within context, and that was the author's original intention. And you're obviously not using it in a derogatory way towards anyone who's in the class. And the fact that this guy is losing his job, and the fact that the school have told him that it was unprofessional, is just outrageous. But it's also nice to see that students are also campaigning for him to not lose his job.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the school looks like they've accused him of not being a good role model. And you think he's exactly the kind of role model, not because of the act of just saying it. It's actually how he explained it. And I think that's the thing, because nowadays, obviously, you'd have to explain why you're doing what you're doing and get the class to take the words seriously. Because I think if I can well imagine that if you just kind of were like you were immature about it as a teacher, and you just kind of read it out and reveled in the kind of taboo busting, and the class was just kind of getting excited by the fact that they were hearing this taboo word, and you didn't explain to them the seriousness of the word, And why it is that people have decided that some people have decided it shouldn't be heard. It's because of the weight of it. It's because it really mattered as a word. And I think that that's the onus on the educator to explain that. So then you don't have the pupils running around the playground shouting that word as a slur at another pupil. Or, I mean, I can well imagine in a very mixed class of students, or rather a class where there's not very many kids who are black, say, and then, there's a teacher who's just willy-nilly flinging the word around, and those pupils are getting excited by the license given to them to say it, that would be could potentially be really quite properly disturbing to a pupil who's then got to go out for the rest of the week with those fellow pupils. So there is that. I think it's not to be cavalier about the weight of words, but it is to say that doesn't mean you can't say them, but we do have to then explain what they meant and why it is that people reacted against them so strongly. And but then that's the lesson of it, isn't it? And he clearly did take it seriously. He wasn't just being a jerk. He was actually seriously trying to teach them something, and regain the power and authority of the teacher as it happens as well. Because if the pupils are saying to you, we dare you to say it, or whatever, you've kind of got to take control of that situation as well and sort of defuse the taboo, while at the same time refusing to bow to it, really, I think.
I do think, to an extent, by not busting the taboo to read something in context that we would out of context find very offensive, you're almost making it a novelty, and, like you say, giving the license, the kids like, oh my God, I'm now allowed to say it in context. Like you're saying, you can still teach that word obviously is one of the worst words in the English language because of the history of it. But by not saying it in context, and therefore, like, the amount that the taboo, even saying it in context, makes that opportunity for students to revel, perhaps, not because they are necessarily racist, but any child who's told that they can't say something, of course, will want to say it with any swear word, no matter how offensive it is. I would hypothesize that by not saying it in context, it almost makes it even worse. And because it will, if there is ever a time that they are given license to say it for whatever reason, it will feel even more that sort of false sense of power, or sort of, reveling in the novelty of it. When really, in my opinion, it should not be a big deal to read something in context. And I've thought about it in a philosophical sense, to do with the word, with any slur. And I would never use the word, obviously, in a derogatory way, but actually, when you're reading it in context, and I think it's quite an interesting topic in general, what is it about language that makes it so offensive to us? But when you really consider what a word is written down, it is just letters in a certain order. And the idea that putting letters in a certain order to say that word out loud, to make that sound, is deemed so offensive. It's quite, when you see it like that, and then see, well, actually, and in this case, we're saying it in context, what is the real harm that is caused by saying it in context? That's not to say out of context that it obviously is extremely offensive when it's used in a derogatory way. But at the end of the day, this is a classic text that happens to have a word that is considered offensive, and that word, like any other word, just happens to be certain letters in a certain order, which therefore makes it a slur.
Well, that's always that's the funny tension, isn't it, with free speech, is that people say, well, it's just a word. And you think, well, yeah, but everything's just a word, but nevertheless, certain words have more power than others. And language is just so obviously so fundamental to us as humans. That's what makes us human in so many ways. So that it's true that you can break it down and say, well, they're just letters. But then sometimes people, they stick at that point and they say, well, it's just a concept. It's even in the kind of sex and gender discussion, people say, oh, well, gender's just a concept. You think, well, everything's just a concept. That doesn't mean it doesn't carry great weight and that it hasn't got, huge meaning as well. So it's not like we can just dismiss it, because somehow there's these things that are real and there's things that are concepts. And it's like a bizarrely animalistic way of understanding the world. But I think in this case, you can see how, in order for young people to grasp racial thinking of the past, they need to understand that the N-word was just threaded through, the way people would have spoken. And, well, in America, much more so in America than over here. But nevertheless, over here, obviously, it was just used in a way. People say, oh, it's just harmless, you can call your black Labrador the N-word and all that kind of stuff. But it was never detached from the fact that it was derogatory. It was derogatory. There's no getting away from that. It wasn't like a friendly nickname given to slaves, or to black people beyond slavery in America. It wasn't that. It was a dehumanizing term. So that's why it matters. But then understanding that it was also something that was really widely used is as a slur, and to keep people in their place and to kind of dehumanize, like calling them boy, or those kinds of ways of using language with great power. That's really important for young people to grasp, because otherwise you cannot imagine the past. You just think it was about minor insults being thrown around, and you never really grasp the weight of racial oppression, for example. How are you going to grasp that unless you realize that it was really threaded through multiple ways in which society operated in America, and to an extent over here, but in very different ways over here.
Yeah, I do wonder what would have happened. Well, clearly not. Like I said, at school, teachers would say it in context, and they didn't get in trouble for it, because I do wonder, what is it something specific about that school, the way that they operate, or in general in America, what is it like in general at schools across the country? Is that word said in context? Or because obviously their history is very different to ours when it comes to racism.
Yeah, I don't know. And it must depend on, it's sometimes it will just be bad luck. These kids, lots of these kids obviously really like the teacher. Yeah. So that the petition or letter that you cited, I think there's over like 360 signatures or something. And this does happen.
I don't know if it's just the students, but it's on Change, and it's got 2,000 signatures. But obviously they won't all be students, because I think anyone can sign it.
Okay. Sometimes there is this spontaneous response, because the kind of teacher that feels confident enough with the students in order to even engage in this would be the kind of teacher that students like, often, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
And we all remember those. So onto this question about language and memory and words and the ability to imagine, and how that can become impoverished if you restrict the words that people can hear and use. So I read on Saturday Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, which I'm holding up for the video people, but obviously the other people won't see it, which I've been meaning to read for ages, actually. And it's a really interesting book, because people normally assume that it's about totalitarianism and they think it's a bit like 1984. That's probably what I would have thought as well. It's the book that probably made book burning into a kind of additional cultural phenomenon rather than just a historical phenomenon. So it became a kind of real reference point, because it's about this kind of brigade of firemen in a slightly future America. So I think it's written in 1953. But Bradbury's imagining this sort of dystopian future where this brigade of firemen, they are tasked by the state with going around with a fire engine and a hose, but it's not filled with water, it's filled with kerosene. And they get reports from informants that an individual possesses books, or a book. Books have been banned, the written word is banned, apart from comic books. And so they will then go, based on a tip-off, to the home. They'll find the book, and they'll just set fire to the book and the home. And it's brilliantly described. It's quite sort of focused in on just what they do. So there isn't a broader description of the whole society, which is why I think it's kind of interesting, because it doesn't sort of tell you about the scaffolding of a broader authoritarian society. This is kind of it. It's the banning of the books have been banned. and they're now burnt. It's a crime to have them, and they're burnt. And one of the firemen, Montag, just starts to have a doubt about what he's doing, which is partly prompted by a young girl, 16-year-old or 17-year-old girl who lives next door, who's this kind of free spirit. And she says to him one day, "Was it always like this?" And she's just got this sense that books have not always been banned. And even though she's young and she hasn't got a memory of it, her family, it seems, have somehow told her that there was a time when books weren't banned. And she's this kind of free spirit who then goes round and is sort of using her imagination, is just so much more curious and emotional than everybody else. So she's looking at the sky and birds and noticing things that people have ceased to really draw any pleasure from. So Montag is just intrigued by her. And at a similar kind of time, he's called upon to go and set fire to a stash of books that have been held in an attic. And the older woman in the house, who's the owner of the books, refuses to leave the property when they're about to set fire to it. And he just tries to persuade her to leave, and she doesn't. And it's all been soaked in kerosene, and the fire brigade are about to torch it, with her included, and he cannot persuade her to leave. And he's also stashed one of the books inside his jacket. And she, rather than being set fire to by the firemen, sets fire to herself on the porch of her house. And it profoundly disturbs him, not just because of what he sees, and that's not particularly described in the book, but during the course of the night that follows, he tries to understand what is it about books that means that she would die for them. And it's just I love those books. Have just got some great ideas for just to chew on. But what Bradbury is really getting at actually is a different kind of thing to just a straightforward anti-censorship line, even though it is about what happens when words are taken away from people and the kind of emotions that you get to explore through reading literature. It's also about a kind of dumbed down culture. So it's very kind of 50s-ish in that sense. It's about the market sort of, and television in particular, mass media. So people don't have books, but they do have multiple TV screens in their houses through which they're kind of living this emotional life. So I would really recommend it to people. I'm sure it's out there in loads of secondhand bookshops off Amazon, I'm sure, and also on Kindle and all of that. So unfortunately, there was a famous film made of it by Francois Truffaut a few decades later, but that doesn't seem to be available. But there's a remake which I think you looked into watching, which is 2018, I think. And you decided not to bother watching it?
I didn't end up watching it because I realised that it probably wouldn't give me a very accurate, because I haven't read the book, but I watched a summary on YouTube, which was quite good. And also wasn't there the aspect of there was this threat of atomic war?
Yeah, that hangs over in the book. Yeah.
And that was what made him think, well, if we've got this threat, then what's so scary about books when there are bigger things? Was that the...
Well, that's not really in the book, actually, but there is this kind of apocalyptic kind of thing hanging over people. But I think they made much more of that in the film, in the new film, which is much more contemporary. Whereas I think the book really delves into literature, because Bradbury was just a bibliophile from being a really young child. And he describes it in the afterword how when he heard about the burning of the Alexandrian library in whatever it was, 48 BC, he burst into tears because he just was such a child who had such a strong affinity with books. And it's beautifully written. And he sort of says that he was much, even though it kind of references Germany in the 1930s and Stalinism and Salem, 1680, which Andrew Dorr has written about at length in his previous book. Actually, he was particularly concerned with this idea that you don't need to burn books if people just stop reading them. So it's very much that kind of anti-mass media sort of sentiment of the time. But anyway, I would recommend it to people. And I'm going to try and dig out the film, the French film, which has got Judy Christie in it playing two parts, apparently. I was looking at it. Anyway, there's a nice little... I can find a passage quickly. I've now lost it. but it pulls out some of the great things about censorship, which is that the commander of the captain of the fire brigade is incredibly well read. So he is quoting literature all the time, but kind of unacknowledged. So he just kind of is eloquent and is quoting without referencing what it is. But he says, so his name's Beatty. He says, one last thing, at least once in his career, every fireman gets an itch. What do the books say, he wonders? Oh, to scratch that itch, eh? Well, Montag, take my word for it. I've had to read a few in my time to know what I was about, and the books say nothing you can teach or believe. They're about non-existent people, figments of imagination if they're fiction. And if they're non-fiction, it's worse. One professor calling another an idiot, one philosopher screaming down another's gullet, all of them running about, putting out the stars and extinguishing the sun. You come away lost. It's just there's so many things like that where you just think, oh my God, that's so good. And there's a reason why it won a Nobel Prize, I think, eventually. Recommended by Barack Obama on the front of the one I watched. So maybe we'll return to some things that we've watched or read. I don't know what will be next. We'll have to discuss.
Did you see the story? I was just thinking about, in general, sort of censorship theme, the story about the golf club, the report, this study that's been done into this golf club that was found that there was laddish banter and offensive comments being made, and that was preventing women and minorities from going to this golf club.
Right.
And it was suggesting that, I guess the conclusion is that the men who go to these golf clubs, and specifically they're businessmen, so they go to socialise, but actually they're negotiating at the same time, trying to secure business deals. And the report, it's quite funny because they go to extreme lengths to say how ethical it is, but also note that one thing that makes it unethical is that they had an undercover guy in this group of men secretly taking notes about their comments.
Ooh.
And they said what made that unethical was the fact that he also didn't step in to intervene and call them out for their comments, rather than the fact that he was basically there like some sort of Secret Service police taking notes of these private conversations. And I found it quite... I found that quite unethical, that people should be able to have these conversations in these sort of social situations, and also quite patronising to women and people of people who have characteristics that put them into a minority group. Because I actually know many, because they referenced homophobia, for example, and I happen to know many women, gay people of racial minorities that have dark senses of humour and can appreciate sarcasm and satire. And I was talking about this on Ben Leo's show last night. And my opposition was saying that actually making jokes like that show actually what you really think. But I think it's, in lots of cases, maybe it might not be the case with these men, but having humour like that, I think it's precisely the opposite, that it's because you don't think like that that makes the joke funny. Because you're not having a stab at the person who if this comment was said seriously, who the person that comment would be about. You're actually taking a stab at the people who seriously think this way.
Yeah,
and that's what, a bit like Ricky Gervais, that's sort of his humour as well. So it's a shame to see time. I guess it was an interesting report, but the fact that people are going to such great lengths to go undercover into social groups to basically shame certain men who have these senses of humour, to say that they must self-censor in order to accommodate other people. But I think it's very patronising and sort of removes agency of, because it suggests that women and people of other minorities, not other minorities, but of minorities, wouldn't feel confident to question certain comments if they did feel uncomfortable. That, what's stopping someone from saying, oh, what do you mean by that comment? And, oh, is that really appropriate? And then they can have that discussion. But to suggest that these men should stop having these comments so that people who might feel uncomfortable can join in, I think is just unjustified.
Well, I suppose that's the point about free association, is that you can draw the boundaries around your group however you wish. And it doesn't have to be inclusive. I mean, social groupings don't have to be inclusive. Yeah. So the idea that every every informal conversation or friendship group should have a kind of DEI quota to it and speak accordingly, is this kind of bureaucratic approach to every part of life. Because I'm sure there are ways in which groups form themselves, and then exclusionary conversation is absolutely part of that. That's just what we do, and we express our prejudices whichever direction they fall. I mean, if you hang out with women fighting for their rights, the stuff you'll hear about men is not exactly, I'm sure a lot of men wouldn't necessarily want to join in with that, and they wouldn't necessarily want to hear it either. But it's kind of just, that's where the boundaries are drawn around the social groupings, isn't it? And it doesn't mean you can't operate in a different grouping differently, but that's kind of the freedom, isn't it? I suppose the demand is made now for this weird consistency across all social settings. The individual must be consistent. So if they say one thing in one setting, they must not be caught out saying something else somewhere else. And it's very thin, isn't it? It doesn't capture the kind of thickness of human interactions, which are just really, really complicated and nuanced. Which is not to say there aren't annoying idiots who just quote Ricky Gervais endlessly. And anyway, that's a different problem.
Well, that sort of concludes, well, I guess that's another attempt to ban banter, which, on that note, remember there's still time to write to members of the House of Lords to urge them to support the amendments to the Employment Rights Bill, which is going to the report stage very shortly. So there's still time to act.
Yes, and I will put this podcast out a little earlier than normal, so that people have got time to use the tool before there may well be, in case there's a quick discussion in the House of Lords. Great. Okay. Well, we'll see everybody next week. Thanks, Connie, and do let us know what you think, and you can let us know suggestions for other things that we discuss or topics to cover in future weeks. Thanks then. Bye-bye.